Shavua Tov. The daf for today is Lamed Hey. We're going to begin with the Mishnah a few lines down from the top of Lamed Hey. And this Mishnah addresses the Mitzva of Matza and exactly what we use to create a Kazayis Matza, what materials the Torah commands us by Erev Tochlu Matzahs in Parshas Bo. Elu Dvarim Sha'adam Yotze Bahem Yidei Chovasa V'Pesach. The 5 grains which can be used to create Matzah and with which we can fulfill our mitzvah of matzah on the night of Pesach. And they are chitim, b'siorim, b'kusnim, b'shifon, u'b'shibola shuol. These are the 5 species of grains. We have wheat, we have barley, we have spelt, rye, and finally oats. And we'll see how to classify them because we have like avos and toldos here. And the main 2 categories are chitim and siorim. The other 3 will fit under chitin and siorim. The Mishnah continues to tell us the yotzim b'dmai. Dmai is matzah that was made of an isa, a dough, and the wheat or whatever grain of the 5 species of grains that was purchased to make this dough was purchased from an Amoretz. And although doraisa we can rely on rov, that rov ha'meoretz ma'asrin heim, we have to be worried about the mute, that maybe the Amoretz was not mafresh maser, and therefore it has the status of Dmai. The Rabbanan said you're not allowed to eat it. However, despite that fact, it is kosher for matzah. The Gemara is going to try to understand why. Then, another case where it's kosher for matzah is b'maser rishon shenitla trumasa. We first set aside truma gedola, then we are mafresh 1/10 of what's left after the Truma Gedola. Let's say 98% is left. He gave 2% to the Kohen. From that 98%, he will give 9.8. That's 1/10 to the Levi. And that applies every one of the years of the Shemitah cycle until we get to the 7th year of Shemitah. The Levi, in turn, when he receives the Maser, he's obligated to be mafresh Maser. And that maser is given to the Kohen. That's called Trumas Maser. And if and when the Levi is mafresh his Truma to the Kohen from the maser that he received, then we have chulin, the remainder, the balance of the grains of mutter. You can make an isa and use it for matzah. But maser sheni v'hegdish and niftu, maser sheni, which is on the first, second, 4th and 5th years of the Shemitah cycle, that's money, 10%, that's designated to be brought to Yerushalayim to be eaten in Yerushalayim, or alternatively, you could be poded and transfer the sanctity of Maser Sheni onto the mos, take the mos to Yerushalayim and there buy food and eat a Kedusha in Yerushalayim. And now the Maser Sheni after Pidyon no longer has Kedushas Maser Sheni, and therefore you're allowed to use it for matzah. And the same applies in Hegdesh. Hegdesh, we're talking, of course, about Kedushas Domim, not Kedushas Guf. Kedushas Guf doesn't lend itself to Pidyon normally. But Kedushas Domim, when I magdish something, I magdish its value for the Beis HaMikdash, and that I could be pod after the Pidyon. If, let's say, it was magdish grains after the Pidyon, he's allowed to use it for matzah. In all these cases, as we go through it, the Gemara is going to try to figure out what the chiddush of the Mishnah is, why the Mishnah felt compelled to teach us this. V'kohanim bechala u'betruma, and kohanim receive both chala from an isa and truma from the 5 grains, from a dough, or from the grains themselves more likely. Dough is already chala, but before it becomes a dough, when it's in the state of the 5 grains, then we give truma to the kohen. The kohen can take that truma and he can make matzah out of it. And the same thing applies with challah. He can take the challah that he receives and he can use it for matzah, assuming it didn't ferment. Once again, we wonder what the Mishnah is telling us. Intuitively, we would say that without the Mishnah, perhaps by virtue of the fact that no one else can eat it if he's not a Kohen, therefore it's not real heter. It's only heter for the Kohen, but kamash malan, that's good enough. Then the Mishnah tells us in what cases is the matzah invalid because it was made from some substance that's osur. For example, the Mishnah mentions avalo b'tevel. Tevel means that he set up his matzah from tvua, which was required, hafrasha required of Trumas and Maisus, and before he takes hafrasha, it's tevel, and that's an Isur Chamur, it's a Chiv Misa B'dei Shamayim, and therefore the matzah is invalid. You cannot be Yotzi a mitzvah with a Chefta B'Isura, because as you're eating this matzah, which is made of tevel, you are fulfilling a mitzvah through an avera, and mitzvah baba avera undermines and disqualifies the mitzvah. Below b'masa rishon shalom mitra trumasa. In other words, once I give ma'aser to the Levi, the maser in the hands of the Levi is tevel until he, the Levi, is mafresh his maser, his truma that he gives to the Kohen. If he makes a dough before he was mafresh, that is tevel and it's not matzah. Lo ma'aser sheni v'egdish alone, if the same would apply before pigeon in the cases of maser sheni and hegdish, which are totally asur without pigeon. Outside of Yerushalayim, we'll see about the status of maser sheni in Yerushalayim, but outside of Yerushalayim, the matzah is invalid. Now, when a person brings a korban todah, he brings 40 loaves of lechamim. Out of the 40, 30 are matzah. They're called chalos, rekikin, and rechuva. But one min, which is 10 out of the 40, is actually made up of chametz. Now, what happens is that he has to be makriv together with the korban todah, one lechem from each of these 4 categories. The rest of them are eaten. They're mutar b'achila. And the pasuk tells us in Parshas Nasa with regard to a nazir that beyond below simei nizro mevi, he has to bring together with el hashlamim 2 categories of matzah, which are called chalos urikikim. He's got to bring 10 lechamim from each one of those 2 minim. So the Mishnah tells us that chalos hatoda urikike nazir, can he use these chalos that are not chametz for matzah to fulfill his mitzvah of matzah? And the Mishnah stipulates that ason li atzmo is ein yotzi behen, ason limchar b'shuk yotzi behen. And we'll see the sugya later, but just to give a little bit of a flavor of what's going on here at the end of the Mishnah with regard to chalos todah and kikei nazir, we would say that if a person has to fulfill his own personal obligation of a korban todah, or in the case of a nazir, of korban nazir, then he cannot use those chalas, which are designated for the mitzvah and fulfill the obligation of someone who's chayav in a korban todah or a nazir. He cannot use them for the mitzvah of matzah. And this has to do with the fact that it's already designated for the korban. However, if it was created for sale in the shuk, in other words, it's not yet sanctified with kedushas korban, he was meaning to sell it out in the market, then he can use it to fulfill his chovas matzah. And the Gemara later on Daf Lamed Ches, which is 3 blot in front of us, hopefully we get there on Yom Shlishi, that is going to be the main sugya that we'll get to then. We start the Brisa. The Brisa says Tana Kusmin, spelt. It's so interesting that Rashi gives us the French word which is spelt as min chitin. It's a subcategory of chitin. However, shibol shul and shifon, oats and rye, min siorin are subcategories of barley. Now, what is the significance of this brisa which the Gemara is quoting here? This has to do with our first trumas and maisus. The halacha is you're not allowed to be mafresh truma from one min to another min. And therefore, if you have chitin and kusmin, that's considered one min. You can be mafresh truma from one to the other, from chitin to siorin, or vice versa. If, on the other hand, you have shifon and shibol shul, that's a different min than chitin and kusmin. And therefore, in those cases of shibol shul and shifon, it's considered one min with barley, with siorin, and therefore you can be mafresh from siorin to shibol shul shifon, and vice versa. The Gemara says, what is kusmin? It's obviously a grain, and it's called gulba. Shifon is a grain that's called dishra, and shibboleth shul is shavile tala. And these are Aramaic names. Rashi, in each case, will give us the Targum in French, in Laz. And the Gemara now is very careful about reading our Mishnah. The Mishnah delineates 5 categories that can be used for matzah. Hani in, only these 5. And the Mishnah is apparently, by virtue of the fact that it delineates these 5, is coming to exclude 1 or 2 other meaning. And one of these that are excluded are orez v'dochan. Orez v'dochan are rice and millet, and lo, they cannot be used to make matzah. You cannot be yotzi yidei chovas matzah with rice bread or bread that's made of dochan, of millet. And the reason why this is so is because you don't usually get a good leavened bread out of rice and millet. And the Gemara says, Minani milu. Is there a source in the Torah from which we derive this conclusion that other than the 5 minim, orez v'dochan are excluded from matzah? And the Gemara answers in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, v'chein Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel, v'chein Tana debei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Amar Kra. This is a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Zayin. The Torah says, Lo sochal of chametz, shivas yomim tochal of matzos. In one pasuk, the Torah enjoins us from eating chametz and commands us to eat matzah. And the contiguity of matzah and chametz is very significant, from which we derive that dvarim adboim lidei chimutz adam yotzi bahen yidei chovasan. You can fulfill your mitzvah of achilas matzah with a matzah that could be chametz. Do you follow what I'm saying over here? This is a very important point. It's only matzah that could become chametz and is a candidate of potential for chametz that can be used as matzah. But in the case of yotza elu she'ein boim lidei chimutz, if you have something like orez v'dochan that can never become chametz, therefore cannot become matzah. So if, let's say, you took orez v'dochan and you soaked it and had it soaking in water for who knows how long, the Gemara says el lidei sirochan ein boim lidei chimutz el lidei sirochan. It will not come to the point of chimutz. It will not be leavened. It will be sirochan. It will be some sort of disintegration, for example. The English translation here goes as follows. Let me just read that to you. It says that excluded from this category are types of flours like rice flour and millet flour, which did not come to leaven, ella, but rather, on the contrary, they come to spoil. Sirochan, he translates to the English as spoil. And in the note he writes, although these doughs may appear to rise when left to sit for a time, but that phenomenon is not due to a process of leavening, but rather to a process of spoilage. All this is before Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Gemara says, Masnisin de lo kir Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion, which stands in contrast to that of our Mishnah? The Omar, he holds orez min daganhu and chayavin al chimutzo kares. It means that, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, rice bread is actually leavened bread and it would qualify as chametz. And therefore, if you don't allow it, you arrest the process of fermentation. It is matzah. You can be yotzei matzah with rice, matzah. The Sanya, as we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oser be'orez v'dochan mipnei shekarov lahachmitz. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is addressing the following reality. If, let's say, you took orez v'dochan, you made a flour out of it, and you started cooking it in water, that cooking process will produce, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, something that is chametz. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's language in this brisa is a bit unclear. He writes karov lahachmitz, and the Gemara is going to try to analyze that. What does that mean, karov lahachmitz? It's close to becoming chametz. But in any event, the very fact that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri classifies Orez v'dochen as a min dagon, and he says chayav mal chimutzo kares, we assume therefore the flip side that you can be yotzi yochiv matzah with rice matzah. And now the Gemara tries to analyze this language of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri of karov lehachmitz, and the Gemara says Toshma Iboilahu. First the Gemara asks the question, then the Toshma. Karov lahachmitz, what does he mean? The kadamu mechametz, he means that orez v'dochen very quickly and speedily become chametz. Karov lahachmitz means as soon as you put the water in, almost immediately it becomes chametz. And therefore, if we accept the kadim v'chametz umachmitz tzad in this suffix, then according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, if you would eat the rice bread, then you'd be chayav kares b'mezin and chatas b'shogeg. It's a full-fledged chametz gabur with a chayav kares and chatas b'shogeg. Oh, Dilma, another possibility is, if we want to interpret karav lahachmitz, it's only close to becoming chametz, that it is havi, but chametz gomer lo havi. It never, ever, even according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, becomes full-fledged chametz. And therefore, even Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri agrees partway to the sheet of the Chachamim that only the 5 species of grains can generate chametz gamur. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say that although you're not chayv kares in the case of orez v'dochen, but it is karv lahachmitz. It's very close to chametz, and therefore you are on the one hand exempt from kares b'mezid and chatas b'shogim, but on the other hand, it is chametz. So we don't know really which is the correct interpretation of the words that Rabbi Yochanan enunciated, karov lahachmitz. And now the Gemara says, Toshma, we're going to quote a brisa to prove this suffix. Omar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, orez min dagon hu v'chayav malchi mutzo kares, and Adam Yotzi Bohem Yedei Chovaso BePesach, from the fact that A, you can be chayav a chiyuv kares for eating an orez bread, that means it's chametz gamur. And number 2, if you don't allow it to rise, you bake it as matzah. You can be yotze yochiv matzah, the mitzvah be'erev tochlu matzahs with rice bread. V'chein hayer Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri went a step further, and he said, karmis is chayeves b'chala. In other words, karmis, whatever that is, the Gemara is going to try to analyze, has the status of a dagon. And the Torah says, Reishis Dagoncha Torimu, you have to be mafresh challah. So you made a dough out of karmis, and you're chayav in challah. Now, chayav challah applies to the isa, to a dough that's made of 5 species of grains. And the Torah says, Mi lechem ha'aretz. Matzah is also called lechem in the pasuk that we mentioned earlier, lechem oni. So we're going to have a gzeres shava lechem, that just like your yotze, the mitzvah of matzah, from 5 species of grains, so too the mitzvah of challah only applies to 5 species of grains. So my karmis doesn't belong to one of the 5 categories. Is it a subcategory? Amar Abaye shitza nisa. So the Gemara immediately asks, my shitza nisa, what is that? And Amar Papa shitza nisa de mishtakha bene kala noisa. And this is amongst the pragim periga, these kind of black seeds. And it's a kind of round black seed. It's very similar to dochan. And in Hebrew, its translation is katzach. Okay then? So let's just read the English translation and see if he adds anything. He says that Shitzanisa is found growing among poppy seeds. Those little black round seeds are called poppy seeds. And These are seeds which can be ground into flour that black in color. They bear some resemblance to millet. As we said before, it's close to millet. And according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you can make a dough out of this kalanisa that grows amongst the poppy seeds. In the Targum, it's called negela, otherwise known as the fennel flour. And again, as we said before, you can take these seeds, make it into flour, and you could actually bake bread out of this flour. Omar Rabba Bar Rav Chana Omer Reish Lakish Isa Shenilosha B'Yayin V'Shem Midvash Ein Chayoven Al Chimutzo Koretz. If you leave out the water, and instead of adding water to the flour, you add either wine or oil or honey, then it cannot become chametz, and you'll never be chayav kares for eating this bread that was made out of, instead of water, out of one of those three juices. Now, what would happen if you made matzah out of these? In other words, you didn't let it rise. Would it be lechem oni? And the answer is no, it's not lechem oni. It would be considered what we call matzah ashira. And you cannot be yotze your mitzvah of matzah with matzah ashira. Okay, that's a point that we'll get back to a little bit later on. Yosef Rav Papa, Rav Huna Bred Rav Yeshua Kami, Rav Idi Bar Ov, Yosef Rav Idi Bar Ov V'Komenamnen. So we'll see that Rav Idi Bar Oven during this dialogue that we're about to record was resting, he was sleeping, he was dozing off. Later on, he'll wake up and come into the picture. Amalei Rav Huna Bred Rav Yeshua Rav Papa. My time of the Reish Lakish, why does Reish Lakish say that there's no chiyuv kares if you take a dough and you knead the dough with wine or with oil or with honey? Amalei Rav Papa responded, the Omer Kra, the pasuk says, Lo sochal of chametz. I'll read the end of the pasuk. It says, Shivas yom tochal of matzos. Dvarim sha'adam yotze ben yedei chovaso b'matzah chayovim al chimutzo karetz. So there's an equation here in the pasuk, as we mentioned earlier, between chametz with a chiyuv kares and matzah for the mitzvah be'erev tochlu matzos. Hoil v'ein adam. Oh, v'ha, that's a key word. V'ha, when you have this, we'll call it a wine bread or an oil bread or a honey bread. Hoil v'ein adam yotze ben yedei chovaso, since it cannot reach the standards and be classified as matzah for the mitzvah of matzah, therefore, havile matzah shira v'ein chayoven al chimutzo kares. Matzah that was kneaded with mei peros, with these kinds of fruit juices, is called matzah shira. It's not lechem oni. And if it's not lechem oni, then if it rises and it leavens, it would not become chametz gomer, and you would not be chayav kares. Now here, again, I want to quote a note here. He says that if you knead the dough with wine, oil, or honey instead of water, one is not liable kares for its leavened form. And we said before, this is called matzah ashira. So let's just note that he says honey could be made from either dates or beets, and either way, it's called honey for our purposes. And we already derived from an earlier drasha that chametz and matzah are two sides of the same coin, they're flip sides. Rav Papa now says that let's derive from the precedent of matzah the parameters of chametz prohibition, and therefore one is liable for kares only for eating a leavened product that could have become valid matzah had it been baked before it was leavened. And in the case of flour that's mixed with fruit juices, it cannot yield valid matzah, and therefore it follows that it's not liable for kares as chametz, because the Torah calls matzah lechem oni. And as Rashi interprets it, that's a matzah that made of flour and water. Once the matzah is enriched with ingredients such as wine, oil, or honey, it no longer can be classified and described as lechamoni, as the poor man's bread. And as far as chametz is concerned, this is not chametz. And that's what we learn here from Rav Papa. Esvei Rav Huna Breda Rav Yeshua Rav Papa. Rav Huna raises the following objection to Rav Papa. The Brisa tells us him chohu ugmo. If he adds water to a loaf of bread and he softens it, it becomes like, it sponges up the water. And now it becomes a liquid. So he took bread, which is a solid, and he converted it into a liquid, and now he drinks it down on Pesach. Im chametzu onish karetz. He will be chayav karetz for eating chametz, even though it's now in a liquid form. But in matzah, who the Brisa says, ein olam yotzi v'chavasa b'Pesach. Now, you just established, Rav Papa, that if it's matzah, then it could be chametz. If it's not matzah, it's not chametz. Here it's not matzah, and yet it's chametz. Yechayiv karetz. It's a hacha dein olam yotzi v'chavasa b'matzah, and nevertheless, chayavim al chimutzo karetz. We see that even something that is not a candidate for the mitzvah of matzah, nevertheless, it does generate kares b'toras chametz if it was leavened. How do we square that with Reish Lakish, who says that the reason why a matzah shira, when you knead it with fruit juices instead of water, you're not yotzei the mitzvah of matzah, and therefore you're not chayiv kares for chametz. And then in the meantime, ita'ar b'hu Rav Idi bar Ravin. Rav Idi bar Ravin was dozing off. Now he woke up. The Amar lahu dardaki. He called them children, meaning that you didn't reach Horah, you don't know enough about Torah, and you misunderstood Reish Lakish. Hainu time the Reish Lakish. What's the reason for Reish Lakish, who excludes a dough that's made with fruit juices from matzah? Because Havilei may peros. And now we turn to Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis, who may peros ein machmitzim. You cannot make chametz out of may peros. And that's the way we have to understand Reish Lakish, that liquids are fruit juices that cannot make chametz. And what that means is that it will never leaven, and therefore you could not be chayiv kares for this chametz.